Hello, everyone. This is Professor Beatty, and I thought it might be useful to start making some weekly recordings, kind of talk you through what's going on. We'll see if this is useful or not, but I'm going to go through what's upcoming in these chapters and what our assignments are a little bit. So I hope it'll be useful to you. I want to make a comment about some of the emails and questions I've been getting. Read diligently all of the things that I'm providing. I'm providing handouts and, of course, things in the book, pages in the book, what stories to be sure to read. Be sure that you are doing all of the required reading. If you skip something, if I have a handout and you skip it, if you don't read the entire weekly page, there's lots of information, as much as I can give you on the weekly pages. If you skip something like that, you're probably going to be confused by the assignments. So be sure that you are going through everything on the weekly page and everything on any handout I might give you. Be sure and look for the handouts. They will have things on them about assignments or how things are done. So don't skip anything that I ask you to read if you want to be able to be successful in this class. This week, since we're starting poetry, we will have poetry journals instead of fiction journals. Poetry journals are different. The instructions are different for poetry journals, so be sure that you read the instructions for the poetry journal. Leave the fiction journals behind. There is a handout for the poetry unit journals. Be sure that that's what you're using from this point forward. Put aside the instructions for the other. Just use the poetry unit journal instructions. Now, I've been giving a lot of second chances and things on papers because people were figuring out what was going on and all that. But from this point forward, you'll need to ask me questions before you hand in the paper or that kind of thing. I usually have things where they can be, up to a week late. Once that's done, I'm not going to be offering lots of second chances like I have been through this unit. So if you have questions, be sure that you ask them ahead of time. I'll do anything I can to help you. Just ask, but we're not going to be having lots of second chance papers moving forward with this class. Okay, so what we're talking about this week will be about reading poetry. First of all, don't be intimidated by poetry. Some people just scares them. They don't even want to give it a try. They don't understand it. They have all these things. Just remember that poetry is like listening to a song. It mentions this in your book. A lot of times the first time you hear a song, you don't get all of it the first time or the second time. You have to hear it several times before you get all of the words or understand what's being said. And so it's important to do that. Be sure that you read poetry aloud. If you don't want your family to hear you, you don't want your roommate to hear you, get somewhere where you can do it, but read it aloud. It will make a big difference to you if you're hearing the words. And you want to pay attention to the punctuation. You read it just as you would read prose. You don't stop until you get to a period. You don't stop at the end of a line. So, for instance, on page 528 in your book, we have the poem Snapping Beans. To read that, I would just read it like I would read anything else. I snapped beans into the silver bowl that sat on the splintering slats of the porch swing between my grandmother and me. I was home for the weekend from school, from the north. Grandma hummed, "What a friend we have in Jesus," as the sun set, pushing its pink spikes through the slat of the cornstalks, through the fly-eyed mesh of the screen. Now, whether the thing that I misread rose and said set, you see that for the sun, you see that you just read it straight through like you would read anything else. Some poetry will rhyme, some of it won't, a lot of it won't. But just read it like you would read anything else. Don't get into the sing-songy thing that people try to do, like I snapped beans into the silver bowl that sat on the splintering slats. That is incorrect. It makes poetry boring, basically. You need to learn to just read straight through a poem, stop when you get to a period, use the punctuation just like you would use it in prose writing. So the pleasure of words is what poetry is all about. Poetry is one of the most ancient art forms. Novels and short stories are relatively new inventions in the history of humans, but poetry has been around thousands of years before Christ, thousands of years BC. Novels and short stories were considered, almost, well, they weren't considered proper even once they came about. An educated person wouldn't have read a novel or a short story. An educated person read poetry. So it has been basic to human experience as long as people have been writing, because poetry is what was written. For instance, the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in poetry. They were written in verse. And we hear this kind of verse. People love rhyme. They love to do things, play with words. You hear this in advertising jingles. You hear this kids on the playground where there's things like the ice cream you scream, or I love to play patty cake with my granddaughters from the time they're itty bitty babies. I'm doing patty cake with them. People love this kind of rhyme and play and sound with words. So this is one of the things that every culture has in some way, shape, or form. Now, are those things poetry? Are things like patty cake, is that poetry? Is that our advertising jingles poetry? Probably not. They probably fall in the realm of what we call doggerel, which is lines that are just kind of trite. They definitely rhyme. They have monotonous sounds, but they still show how poetry is basic to what people like. It touches people. We use it to have fun with. So just plunge into the poems that you have to read and think about how they sound, all that kind of thing. Poetry is language distilled down. It's intense, concentrated language. So unlike a short story or a novel, the poet has to say what they have to say in a very small amount of words, a very short space of time. There are long epic poems, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. We're not going to get into that kind of poetry, but for the most part, the poetry we're going to read, you think that it's like it was just, taken down to its bare minimum. They have to say what they have to say in as few words as will fit into whatever poem scheme, whatever rhyme scheme or type of poem they're using. Now, once you start writing about poetry, excuse me, you'll often find that the papers you have to write are longer than the poem. This is normal. It's not weird to think, okay, I spent two pages writing about a 4-line poem. That is perfectly normal. What you're doing when you write, and you'll have one paper, again, as you did in the fiction unit, you're really scrutinizing the poem's language. You're looking at every word. You're looking at what the author had to say, how they said it, what type of images are they trying to use? Have they used this image before? Does this image pop up over and over? So it's not as difficult to write a paper about a poem that's much longer than the poem as it might sound, because you're analyzing the poem. You're taking the poem apart and putting it back together in ways that make sense to you. So you're taking everything about it apart as you write your paper. So you'll be developing a solid claim. We talked about this before, the same meaning as argument. You're going to develop some kind of claim about the poem and then back that claim up with evidence. And when we talk about a claim, we're talking about what is the author trying to do with this poem? What is the work he hopes this poem performs? Or when he uses a particular image or a particular allegory, particular symbol or metaphor or something, what is he trying to do with that? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about developing a claim about the poem. So you're looking at it and you're saying, what was the author trying to do with this? Or what does the poem do? Sometimes things happen in a poem that the author didn't even intend. So sometimes it isn't about what the author intended, it's about what the reader can take out of it. But you're looking for something deeper. You're not looking for the surface. You're looking to analyze the poem and say, what was the work of this poem? What did this poem do? Now, in poems, words call attention to themselves. That's all the poem has, is its language. Poets don't have settings and characters and action to any great degree. Of course, poems, depending on the type, they might have a character in them, they might have a setting, but that's minor compared to the words. They have to convey the meaning that they're trying to get across gracefully and economically, so with very few words. So this is why words are what we're talking about. When we talk about poems, we're talking about what are the words that the poet used to get across his meaning. All right. In the chapter on word choice, they talk a lot about diction. They talk about several types of diction, and you look for these in a poem. There was a type of writing done more so in the 18th century that was called poetic diction. It was very overblown. It was very formal. It used a lot of classic references and that kind of thing. And then the Romantic movement at the end of the 18th century was starting to move away from this. They felt that it was much too overblown, that the common people couldn't understand poetic diction. They did use formal diction. Now, they were trying to move closer to the language of the people. Formal diction is still elevated. It's still probably impersonal, but it's not the same type of thing as poetic diction, where they were definitely writing to an educated population. We have middle diction, which is more the way educated people would speak it. You're not speaking in a formal tone, but you're still using proper words. You're still using proper grammar. You're not moving into a lower level of speech as you would with informal diction. This is more, you start using slang. They would start using different types of words or phrases that are much more informal, more the way a person talks in their everyday life to their friends or something, rather than the way you would talk in a paper or, maybe to a teacher. So there's these different levels of diction, and you think about this. Were they being very informal in the poem? Were they being more formal? Where does the diction of the poem lie? There's another type of language to take into account, dialect, which is when they are trying to represent the way a certain people group speak. So they may be trying to make it sound like the people are from the South, and they will specifically use words and phrases and spelling that indicates how they want you to pronounce the words to sound more like a Southerner than a Northerner. Or alternatively, it could be a person from India who would pronounce words differently, or a person from South America who would pronounce words differently. So if they're talking in dialect, they're talking about what types, how they're really trying to represent how that person speaks, how they sound. And then there's jargon. Jargon is specialized language that, for instance, in English, we have our own jargon when we talk about things like poetic diction, or when we talk about certain, literary theories. Doctors have their own jargon, terms that they use all the time amongst themselves, but that people who aren't doctors probably don't know. Every profession has that. Even baseball players, dentists, as it lists in our book. Everybody that's in a group will have a jargon that's words and phrases they use, and they all know what they mean, but the rest of us probably aren't that familiar with it. So you can see that in poems too. Now, some other terms that come up in your reading this week: denotation. Denotation is the literal dictionary meaning of a word, but connotation is the baggage that it carries with it. So if people say dog, you probably think of a dog, your pet dog or something like that. But you can have a connotation if you were to say she's a dog. Okay, what does that mean? I don't know. It could mean you're talking about someone ugly or someone mean or whatever. But connotations are the associations that go with different words. So most words have a denotation, a literal meaning, and a connotation, all the baggage that the word is carrying with it when you hear that word. Ambiguity is very important in poetry. Ambiguity is allowing two or more interpretations of a word or a phrase. You'll see several in your text. It'll talk about ambiguity, but ambiguity is used a lot in poetry so that you could read it excuse me, in a literal sense, or you can see another meaning that the poet was trying to get to with that particular word. The tone, when you come across that term in your book, it's the writer's attitude towards the subject or the mood created by the elements of the poem. All right, let's look at, there's a poem by Paul Dunbar on page 581. He says, "Dear critic, who my lightness so deplores, would I might study to be prince of boors. Right wisely would I rule that dull estate, but, sir, I may not, till you abdicate." Okay, so someone has criticized his writing and he's talking back to them, and he has a very sarcastic tone. This is what we're talking about. You can tell he's being very sarcastic towards the people that wrote. Poems can have all kinds of tones. They can be serious, they can be happy, sad, playful, bitter, affectionate. So when we talk about tone, we're just talking about this is the writer's attitude towards his subject and the mood that's created by it. Sometimes people just get scared off by these terms, and they're just, they shouldn't scare you off. Poetry is the place where you play with language, where you have fun with language. And when you think about the tone of the one that you're reading, what mood was he trying to create? Okay, this week you have 5 vocabulary words as usual: paraphrase, poetic diction, enjambment, denotation, and connotation. Look them up in the back of your book. For the quiz at the end, for the test at the end of the unit. 2 assignments this week. You'll have a poetry journal over We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. Again, be sure you're using the instructions for poetry journal and not the previous instructions. And then you have a discussion board over the poem, The Convergence of the